Lisa is an entrepreneur, investor, speaker, and author of the best-selling book, The Mesh, Why the Future of Business is Sharing. She's the chief instigator of Mesh Labs, a global community for the sharing economy. She works in the intersection of new urban innovation and new models, partnerships and communities in which access to goods, services, and talent triumphs over the ownership of them. Lisa invests, advises, speaks, and writes on the topics of innovation, collaboration, and the share economy, including cities as platforms, the power of peers, shareable business models, building trust in a shared world, the hidden value in waste, and the rise of entrepreneurship. At her core, Lisa is a marketect and an impact junkie with a strong interest in breaking the edges of formerly happy business models and bringing together not-so-likely characters in the form of new offerings, teams, and partnership. Thank you, Lisa Gansky. Come on up.
So I don't know why I couldn't shake this phrase that friends of mine taught me years ago from South America, that's estamos juntos, pero no están revueltos, which essentially means we're together but not scrambled. So I thought, oh, that's a great idea. It makes perfect sense in the middle of the night. So this morning with my frying pan, I went thinking I would start the slide with 2 sunny-side-up eggs. And I opened the first egg, and it was a 2-yolk egg. So I thought, well, density. So we're together, closer, but still not scrambled. So I want to talk to you about the intersection of the sharing economy and cities, and why I've been fascinated about that for the last few years. And I think that I'm extremely excited to be in conversation here with you. So if we do a fast look back to last century, it's what I refer to as the century of the generals. General Motors, General Electric, General Mills, General Dynamics. It's top down. Don't worry, we have it handled. You just do what we say. This century is a totally different thing, a totally different phenomenon. We're connected to more people than ever before. We have incredible tools, and many people are completely annoyed and distrusting of large organizations. So instead of one-to-many, we're finally many-to-many. And one of the main principles that we're organized around isn't new to us. It's sharing. Now, sharing actually isn't new to cities. As we think about it, we've been sharing public spaces. We share transportation. Things like cafes, pubs, beers, certainly conversation, and infrastructure. My insurance company shouldn't know that I took this picture, just for the record. And the way that I think about it, or as I've referred to it in the Mesh, is essentially that we're at a moment in time where we're moving from a world that was organized around ownership to a world where we're looking at access actually triumphing over ownership. Access to goods, services, and talent. So some of what's making all of this happen right now? Population. When you have more people in more or less the same physical space, there's an invitation to have less stuff. Today, literally this morning, it was a little scary watching, I don't know if you've ever seen the global population ticker, but I actually couldn't do a screen capture because I guess someone's born every 8 seconds, someone dies every 12 seconds. It's very humbling. So 7.11 billion people this morning, and then 9.6 according to the latest UN report by 2050. So 75, depending on what kind of prediction you look for, between 75 and 80% of the world's population by 2050 is predicted to be living in urban environments. Again, humbling and something I'm sure that's possessing a lot of your thinking. I'm a huge fan of caffeinated art. This is something that I pinched from Open Copenhagen. It was an inspiration for thinking about climate change, which is one of the other vectors for what's happening. So, nature does bat last, and as we'll see, and we've unfortunately witnessed already, many surprises, unanticipated consequences that are inviting us on a fairly regular basis to rethink and reshape. And then This is a historic moment. We're actually more connected to more people than ever before. Technology connects us to each other and to things. That's a really interesting opportunity for creating what I would call sort of legibility or visibility in terms of new kinds of marketplaces. So things that we actually couldn't see before that were available or potentially available now become visible. And that creates a whole new kind of opportunity and economy. And then the last thing is the recession, downturn, reshaping of capitalism, whatever you call it. But that's the basic invitation for all of us to rethink ourselves, and with respect to ourselves personally and our business or organizations, how do we think about value and cost and their relationship? And so I think it's invited many people to actually reconsider how much things actually cost and what's the value of hanging on to things. And so that caused me to, one of the fundamental tenets of the mesh is unused value equals waste. That is, things that we value, if you're a business on the asset side of the balance sheet, when you're not using them, intellectual property, factories, a truck fleet, when they're sitting around, or in my case, 5 bikes in my one butt and 5 bikes in my garage, those sorts of things, 3 kayaks, a bunch of tools that I used 7 years ago, but they're just sitting around. So there's all this kind of value, but there's basically 2 kinds of ways. One is that there's the kind of excess capacity. So that's things that are sitting around idle, not being used, but they actually have potential value if they're somehow accessed. And the second kind of value is kind of the stuff we throw away. So like, as my friend Bill McDonough always says, he giggles when people say throw away. He puts up a map of the world and he says, so tell me, where is away? And so this idea of basically waste is also things that we recover, and part of what we're seeing in the sharing economy is a supply side recovery of old products so that they can be brought back into the supply chain. So I want to focus on, did I miss a slide? No. I want to focus on for a second just this idea that we're starting to see many, I would say thousands or tens of thousands of examples around the world where people are just starting interesting projects. Some of them turn into amazing companies or collectives. This one is in Brooklyn, and it's essentially people taking on why do we throw things away when they break? Why don't we kind of relearn or learn to fix them? There's a similar one called the Repair Cafe that I visited in Amsterdam. And a lot of these things are addressing the second kind of waste. And then there's this phrase that I love that the British use, because they have all these lovely phrases, which is meanwhile use. And it's essentially like, meanwhile, while we're not using it for this, let's use it for that. And they actually have policies and tax incentives that are connected to property tax that incent people who own buildings to convert to meanwhile use for social good. And so one of the organizations, this is a nonprofit in the UK called 3Space, lovely group of folks, and they actually created this organization to take advantage of this tax break. And what they do, it's a marketplace. So on one side, they have people who have a surplus of capacity, banks that don't need all the branches anymore, retail stores that don't need all the storefronts anymore, office buildings that are just hanging around. Maybe the tenant left and there's 2 or 3 month period where the building is empty. Normally, the landlord wouldn't care about that because he's sitting with a bigger contract, but there's now an incentive to actually not have that kind of vacancy. And so, for example, the government actually has a program where they're trying to stimulate makers and entrepreneurs around the country. And so they turned over quite a big facility, an entire office building in Wimbledon, which is just outside of London, to these guys. And they're running all sorts of programs and workshops and hackathons. And it's been going for months. And they get quite a bit of engagement. So it's a little early to to say what the result is 2 or 3 years down the way, but this is quite an interesting phenomenon. And I know that I've forgotten the name now, but I've noticed that someone is speaking, I think tomorrow, from New Zealand who has a similar kind of project. So these sorts of things are happening in many places. This is one that's called Mess Hall, but I'm just putting it up to mention that many of these spaces or places or organizations have a kind of manifesto that's organized around being open, generous, inclusive, a space for experimentation. If we look at this whole phenomenon of excess capacity, we can see it play out in all sorts of areas. And one of them, luckily for us who live in the San Francisco area where the taxi system isn't brilliant, is a lot of these private organizations have stepped in to, as an entrepreneur, I would say, we're the I always say first, as a confession, entrepreneur is French for can't hold a job. But in the case of this, entrepreneurs are very trained at, like in the nature of bores a vacuum, you fill it. And so in this case, there was a vacuum, and companies like Sidecar and another one, Lyft, that you may have heard of, they basically are tapping into the excess capacity of seats in a car that's already going somewhere. And so someone in your area that's not a professional driver can provide a ride, and these kind of mobile-driven apps have been creating all sorts of interesting marketplaces and disrupting what were historically the transportation services. We're seeing this also, this may surprise some of you, that the largest growing segment of the travel industry is private homes. And this is another kind of marketplace where this excess capacity is playing out. So how many people here have heard of Airbnb? Okay, so Airbnb is the largest one, and basically the way it works is if you have a room or your entire home that you want to make available to a visitor, then you basically you become a host and you put up whatever it is that you're offering on the marketplace. If you're somebody who's traveling or looking for a place, like I stayed in an Airbnb last night here in Berkeley because I live an hour north and I'm not that good in the morning. And so you can, on either side, you have a two-sided peer network or peer marketplace. So you're actually doing kind of going native when you travel. You're staying with somebody who lives in the area, or in a community. If you take the whole home, you're staying in the community. And so this idea that started because a couple of guys were needing to make money and pay the rent turned into a very vibrant, incredibly fast-growing, and very well-received marketplace. As of today, there's over 500,000 listings. The company's about 5 years old. To give you a sense of scale, they're the largest hotel chain in the world, which is Intercontinental, has been in business for about 60 years, and they have about 600,000 rooms. They own the inventory. Airbnb doesn't. The second largest, the Hilton, has been in business for about 90 years. They also have about 600,000 rooms. So these things, with the network effect, have tremendous scale and actually incredible ability to be resilient, so that if you need more rooms in some moment because the World Cup is coming to Rio, or because of the Sandy storm, you can do all sorts of shout outs and recruit people and build your inventory on an as-needed basis in really interesting ways. Secondly, the 8.5 million guests so far, meaning stays, and then at the peak of this summer that just passed, 175,000 people stayed on the peak night in an Airbnb someplace. And then this is really interesting, and it's a phenomenon that happens with Etsy, another peer-to-peer marketplace, and many of them, which is that people who are, it's like the old Hair Club for Men commercial, I'm a customer but the president as well. If you're a host, if you put your home on the network, you make money. And there were 65,000 people who actually used all of their earnings, or I should say it another way, who traveled and only had to use their Airbnb earnings to pay for their travel. So they basically were a host and a guest. Interesting phenomenon, and that, to me, that also means the community has a lot of integrity, and the people are, drinking the Kool-Aid. They're all very keen on the whole movement of what's happening. So the trend, I think, here is about better things easily shared, designing better things, and learning to share them in really fundamental ways, designing systems that are optimized for sharing. And increasingly, I think we're going to see that shared things, or things that are designed to be shared, will have more value. Which brings us to cities. Cities, from my view, are just platforms for sharing, and the intersection of cities and the sharing economy is really exciting. A lot of what the folks said in the morning is very much the tempo. It's looking at what I call, it's hard to say, softecture. This idea of kind of skinning a city, of making it be iterative and make it be responsive, whether it's, even if it's the hard part of the city, like buildings or the street, meaning physically hard. Meanwhile spaces, the reworking and rethinking of things. The whole notion of belonging, I think, is worth mentioning, but I don't have much time to go into the conversation, nor truthfully do I have much to add other than saying this, that the surprise inside the sharing economy is that people actually, they usually do it because it makes sense financially, but that what has happened is people report that they had such an amazing experience that they want to continue to do it. That part of what happened is they felt connected to others. They felt that it was more intimate, that it was just this really, you were dealing with a person, and you kind of really went native in this community, or you're getting to know the people in your own community. And then for me, access is the currency, that like we looked at when we were coming from, or still are in technically, a debt culture, the way that we navigate that was, whether or not we pay our bills on time. And in this case, it's really, did you return the zip car with the smell of a wet Labrador? Or, were you late when you left your homestay place? Or those sorts of things. How good are you when you're in a makerspace, participating and playing and working with others? And so there's reputation and currency and access in this marketplace, in this moment, all go together. So one of the main ideas for me is everything is built here on the idea of a platform. And one of the fundamental qualities of a platform is that it's open. And so open is invitational. It's bringing other parties in. It's embracing a more extensive ecosystem. And it's embracing cities and communities, local government, and businesses and whoever else is showing up to play or to disrupt. A great example of these platforms, and we're seeing them all over the place, like, for example, who here has ever used Google? Good. So if you search for something last year and you search for it this year, you're going to get a way better result this year. And the reason is that cleverly their business model is designed around all of us using the service, making the product better, and making the experience better. And our life right now is filled with many of these kinds of services. Waze, I don't know if you've ever used it, but it's one of my favorite apps. I've used it in probably 7 or 8 different countries. And it's essentially I think their tagline is something like outsmarting traffic together. And so the idea is that you are able to figure out what's the best way to go someplace, not just by the math of what's the shortest distance, but like an up to the second, where there's a detour, where there's been an accident, where there's flooding, and it reroutes you on the basis of all of us actually adding to the viability and the vitality and the reality of what the map sees. These sorts of services are increasingly fundamental, and as we look at placemaking and as we look at the whole notion of resilience, we see this whole idea coming forward in many aspects. Jogabo is a different thing, but again, it's bringing us together. This was designed by guys who love football, soccer for us, and they just want to play wherever they go. So their big issue was, how do you find a game? Well, as a result of building this for themselves, they ended up building a global community of people who enjoy playing soccer and hanging out together, and it's a sort of a different kind of a social network, and it's an app that allows for engagement. And it's people use it in their local cities to meet other folks, and it's been a really interesting service to watch grow. But from my perspective, technology connects us, humanity unites us, and that phenomenon is really what resiliency in many aspects is going to come to. And so at the heart of the innovation around the sharing economy is this culture of generosity, this idea that I'm going to do it because it feels good, or I'm going to do it because somebody did something already for me, because the service is working, Waze is working because somebody tapped something and said that there was a traffic incident. So now it's no big deal for me to also say that there's a detour. As we think about the innovation and the generosity, it also extends to the financial realm. And as John mentioned, we're looking at a moment when these platforms are driving a lot of community-driven commerce. The ability to create, whether it's a maker idea, a new company, an organization, or civic projects, there are over 1,000 crowdfunding platforms around the world. Kickstarter, Indiegogo that we're familiar with here, all of these sorts of things actually are now starting to branch out with a lot of specificity geographically and from a vertical perspective. And so this one is in the UK, it's called Space Hive, and it's specifically targeted to civic projects. It essentially is crowdfunding, meaning that we are, the person who puts the project up reaches into their social network and tries to grow the community of people who begin to care about and want to support financially this project. What's great about that is that you have then a built-in community if the project gets funded to then activate whatever space or project you're launching. A lot of this for me is making this cocktail between the way that we think about public and private, money and spaces. And so this is another intersection where there's going to be big innovation and real opportunities for marketplaces, projects, and interesting intersections. We're at the beginning. I think it's very clear that we're all learning to cha-cha here. We're making this up. We're learning to dance together. We have to kind of learn to work together in new ways. And I think in as much as it's DIY, increasingly I think people are realizing that it's DIT, do it together. We're seeing companies, not new, but increasing. Whole Foods gives a percentage of their profit to, basically looks to the community and says, where do you want us to invest this money? So does Credo and many other organizations. Waitrose is a high-end grocery store in the UK, and just another example of companies kind of getting more civic-minded and wanting to put money back into the community in a way that also ties the community to the project. Another crowdfunding platform targeted specifically to food. There's been a lot of movement, which I was a little surprised about in the last year, about addressing the relationship between the community, the neighborhood, the city, and the food supply. Here we have Food Start, which is a platform that if somebody wants to start a food truck or a restaurant or a catering business, any of these can be launched with this service. Many of us have either heard about hacking, participated in a hackathon, pretended to participate in a hackathon. But this idea of bringing together constituencies around a specific topic and basically engaging people in a fairly free-form discussion and exercise to create, to reframe the problem typically, and hopefully even begin to, energize and emerge a few solutions. And so I think, we've seen all sorts of hacks, people who individually will go off and take something and repurpose it. This guy slightly north of London decided that he was going to take over a dumpster and make it into his pool. So there's a lot of those sorts of things that we see around. This one is something that emerged at the end of last year. I had to use it because of the tagline. But basically, these guys are putting together, open source meat. So they're wanting to. It's a lot of this is about creating transparency, understanding where things come from, engaging the community to be able to monitor and track, and to make all of us aware of the source of things, so that when you make choices, you can have trust. And so we see these sorts of projects emerging from the format of hacking, but hacking is something that's very extensible and has been applied to many things. And so there's the phenomenon of urban innovation in many cases needs a place. The opportunity to experiment, to see how things are going to work, to what they look like, how they fit, who really wants to support them once they're there. And can you get to put it in place, or at least a prototype in place, fast enough to address whatever the opportunity or problem is at hand? And so we're seeing other projects. This one is called Free Space. It's in San Francisco. And it's essentially a group of people. I don't know if Mike Zuckerman's here, but it took over a building about 9th, 10th, and Market. And essentially the community is deciding what goes on in the building. They've painted the building fairly wildly, I think. They had a little bit too many espressos and a lot of paint. And here they've used the parking lot and formed a partnership with somebody who had shipping containers. And basically, they're doing kind of a learning environment in a box and all sorts of things that could be ported to other cities or communities fairly easily. And so like Parking Day, projects like this, which are happening in many parts of the world, are enabling a new kind of in vivo testing. I think that for me, a lot of what I've been hearing in speaking with people, and hopefully we'll get a chance to speak as well, this topic of resilience, of basically being able to respond to the unexpected, is really fundamental. The way that planning has happened, the time it takes, the sort of we're looking for soft bones, not hard bones in a way, and so the idea of basically being responsive to things that are either about to happen or have happened is fundamental. There's two ways to think about being resilient. One is the paying attention to the physical infrastructure. That is, resilience, if you ask people in energy companies or water companies or many cities around the world, has to do with the transportation system, the energy systems and the water systems, the communications systems in themselves being able to adapt as things change. But there's another sort of level of resilience, and that's kind of where the feet meets the street. That's the people and the way that the community is connected to each other as people. This project came out of a project, or rather a survey done by an organization called the Eden Foundation in the UK. And in 2008, they decided they were going to do a survey because word had it that people in the UK weren't happy. So they did this survey, and this is like the Gansky summary, so statistically not accurate, but the large number of people basically said, the food sucks, the weather sucks, my commute's terrible. I'm not thrilled about my job, but I'm not even upset about that. The thing I'm really upset about is I don't feel at home when I'm home. I don't actually feel connected to my people. And I don't know what to do about that. And so the Eden Project came up with this idea in 2009 in the summer called the Big Lunch. And it was a little crazy, but they decided they were going to reach out to people in different communities and ask someone to volunteer in their block to be a host. And their job was to get all of their neighbors at a certain time on a certain day in June or July to come out, set up a big table, and have all the neighbors come out and have lunch together. And when I heard about it, I was thinking, that's really adorable, but it's the UK. Like, let's see what happens. Well, 1.1 million people came out on the first year and had lunch together. And they had such an amazing time of meeting their neighbors and hanging out and seeing their kids play and realizing, you know, where they live and who they live near, that they've continued to do it. And last year, which was, I guess, the fourth year, they actually had 8.5 million people all around the UK hang out and have lunch together. And it's one of these things where I look at this and say, like, this is an example of the resilience gym, where we're starting to build the muscle memory for being connected at the level of the neighborhood. Because for my taste, I think the next big social network is our neighborhoods. So agile cities really are cities that have a sharing layer, and the opportunity of what the city becomes when we leverage this and begin to integrate it in ways that we haven't begun to even think about is really exciting. So a friend of mine is the head of resilience and sustainability and strategy for GE. And I asked for some numbers, and these were the happiest ones I could find. Because I didn't want to be depressing, it's the morning. But 905 natural disasters, 106 million people affected in 2012, and $160 billion rather, of damage related to natural disasters in 1 year. So, a springboard for where we go from here and what's next. I'm a fan of making little mistakes fast and early. Hopefully they're inexpensive, and hopefully we share them. In 2005, France decided they were going to launch a bike sharing program that had some interesting technology, and they were going to get a different business model behind it so that they could potentially get scale around the city. They launched in Lyon. They learned a lot, and they refined all the early mistakes they could find, they fixed, and they relaunched in Paris in 2007. That experiment and France's openness and generosity has led us to the fact that more than 500 cities around the world have active and growing bike sharing systems. Bike sharing is the fastest growing form of personal transportation on the planet. I found, I guess I was just in New York, and they said that they're at about 1 million miles a month. They launched on Memorial Day, so for the last 4 months, they've hit 4 million miles with people using City Bike around the city. So the opportunity, because we're all connected in theory, is to actually be connected and to basically what I call leverage scar tissue, share the things that didn't work together so that we don't have to repeat the mistakes of others. We can kind of stand on the shoulders of, like in this case, Lyon and Paris. As I think about it, or I have thought about it, and I'm putting this out because many of you may know of many things, hopefully, that I'm unaware of, but there's a platform called Honest Buildings. It was designed to create visibility, transparency, and an ecosystem in and around the built environment. And so this is a business that's fairly young and growing out of New York. But it occurred to me that while they're looking at the building specifically and having a history of the building and who did what work and all of what's in the building in terms of content and from a materials perspective as well as from a business perspective, I was thinking, like, well, what about the surrounds? What about the roof? What about the parking spaces? What about the other aspects of the building where there could be iterative design and user-generated goodness? And could we actually convince Honest Buildings to allow us to be able to have a global platform where we could begin to keep track of these kinds of projects? Because they're happening really fast, and I don't think any one of us in the room knows all of what's happening around. The second thing, and I think I warned John, Bella, and Gio. But with Mesh Labs and Rebar and Free Space, I'm proposing as partners that we begin a conspiracy together, hashtag Civic Hack Day, and that sometime next year we pick a date where we agree that there's going to be a global civic hack. And the opportunity is to actually engage all of us around the world to create a kind of enchantment and safe space, potentially awards or some kind of engagement. There's a lot of media that would love to begin to cover these sorts of things. But the idea is essentially to call everyone together so that we ourselves can start to see what's really happening at the scale that it's happening. Scale, by the way, I think in terms of where we're going versus where we were, is going to be kind of like Jane Jacobs referred to cities as networks of neighborhoods. I think networks of these little micro communities or these civic hacks are going to actually be a kind of scale that we aren't in condition to track, but we should be. Or I'd love if we could be. So I'm just here to invite all of us. We're at the very beginning of something I think is fundamental. I would like to invite all of us to put on some protection, stand back from whatever looks like it might explode, but begin to make experiments and to play and make mistakes and experiment and share. Turns out that it's not so easy to be a food stylist, because when I saw this, I thought, this is the scrambled eggs, so sorry for having to show you this in the morning. I'll do better next time. But I think we could aspire to be scrambled in a way that makes us strong and resilient. So, thank you very much. I'd be